baking with fresh milled flour could be easier and more convenient than traditional flour from the store. Today I'm going to share with you my top 5 tips for making it more convenient and easy to do your baking with fresh milled flour. I'm Melissa from the blog appletreeonthecorner.com, where I share about food from scratch, family meals, and rhythms of home. All right, so tip number 1 is think about how you set up your kitchen. If your grain mill is tucked away in a cupboard and your wheat berries are maybe stored in a 5-gallon bucket somewhere, it is going to be, there's a lot of inhibition to getting it out, plugging it in, finding your wheat berries, grinding them, measuring them, and going from there. But if you have everything laid out in such a way that it's more convenient to get to those things than it is to get to your white flour, you'll find yourself reaching for the white flour less often. So for example, I just keep my grain mill on my counter and I keep my grains right next to it. My next tip for actually baking with wheat berries more often is to measure the wheat berries, not the flour. So I think a lot of times when people bake with fresh milled grains, they mill up a big batch of it and then measure it from there and put it in the recipe. Okay, so there's a few reasons that I recommend measuring the grains instead of the flour. The first one is it's just less messy. So I find that if I mill it first and then measure the flour after that, you just get flour everywhere. Whereas if you measure the wheat berries ahead of time and you just mill enough for your recipe, you eliminating that step of having to then remeasure the flour. When you measure flour, everyone has different things they say, like don't scoop it out of the bin, you should sift it, like scoop it and sift it into your measuring scoop and then flatten it out. I think it's actually more consistent if you're baking by volume to measure the wheat berries because they don't compact like that. So if you know, okay, this is how many wheat berries I'm going to use for a cup of flour, I think it's a little bit less variable how much flour ends up in your recipe when you do it that way. And so you might be wondering, well, how many berries do I need? And so this is going to be my third tip, to know the conversion for wheat berries to flour. A third of a cup of wheat berries yields half a cup of wheat. So to make it extra easy, in my canister of flours, I just keep a third of a cup here. I also have a whole cup, measuring cup in one of them too. But having the third of a cup right here ready to go, whatever a recipe calls for, I don't even have to go get out measuring spoons. They're just right there ready to measure into my recipe. If I am doing a recipe that calls for flour by volume, I have this here. If I'm doing one that calls for a recipe by weight, I keep in this cupboard right here a little basket with the rest of my little baking supplies, and on top is the scale that I've used for years when I make bread to measure out the ingredients. So again, very handy to either measure by volume or by weight right here. My next tip has to do with ingredients. I'm going to first talk about wheat berries, and then I'm going to talk about a couple other things that you might find helpful if you are wanting to cook with more fresh milled grains. So as you can see, I have several canisters of wheat berries right here, and you do not need to start with that many. If you are getting started grinding your own wheat, I recommend this grain is called hard white wheat. There are 2 main hard wheats that you'll find on the market. One is called hard red wheat, and the other is called hard white wheat. And red wheat is your more traditional whole wheat flavor and texture, and white wheat is softer in flavor and texture. So if you're getting started trying to eat more whole grains, more fresh milled, the softer texture and flavor of the hard white wheat, I think, is more is easier to adjust to if you're making the transition from, say, all-purpose flour or bread flour to fresh milled flour. If you get more into it, there's also soft wheats. I have soft white wheat next to it on the counter here, and as just a quick, you can get into this more, but as a quick rule of thumb, hard wheats are best if you're trying to get a high structure to the loaf of bread you're making. So like with a traditional like sourdough loaf or an artisan bread, and you want that nice lofty rise, you're going to want a hard wheat for that. If you're making something like a cookie or a biscuit, soft wheat is the more traditional wheat to use for that. Now, one extra thing is that you can use hard wheat to make something like a cookie, which would traditionally call for soft wheat, but you can't use a soft wheat to get enough rise for a loaf of bread like you need with a hard wheat. So that's why I would recommend a hard white wheat if you're getting started. It's more versatile, and I think the flavor and the texture is more palatable to someone who's just getting started with this. One other thing I want to say about moving towards more freshly milled grains is that if your family is not used to eating whole wheat, I really recommend starting your bread recipes by switching out a quarter of the flour instead of like the whole thing. We started doing a quarter and then a third and then a half, and now I can bake a loaf of sourdough bread, like a sourdough loaf of bread, 100% fresh milled. Sometimes I do 100% one and a 60% one, depending on what people want that day, to give a couple options. But you don't have to go 100% all in, and I think that easing your family into it will make it a much more successful and enjoyable process of eating more fresh milled grains. Another ingredient you might want to know about is called vital wheat gluten. Vital wheat gluten is basically a way to add extra gluten to the structure of your dough. If you're used to making bread made with all-purpose flour, you get that nice billowy, lofty texture in it. Baking with whole grains will be more dense. It won't necessarily be like rock solid dense, but it's a earthier, it's a heartier loaf of bread. And adding gluten to your loaf can help get you just a little bit more structure to get a higher rise in your loaf. I only find that I need this when I'm baking like a loaf of bread, not like, cookies or something like that. And I usually add about a tablespoon up to a quarter a cup, depending on how much dough I'm making, and you can experiment with that to see what you like. The other thing about ingredients that I wanted to mention is that when you use fresh milled grains, they are thirstier than an all-purpose flour would be. So you may, as you work with your doughs, you might notice like they're drier or they're stiffer. And I think up to like a quarter cup extra water might be needed at times when you're converting a recipe to using fresh milled grains. My next tip has to do if you're a sourdough baker. And it's really just that you can keep your starter with fresh milled grains. Because the fresh milled grains oxidize quickly, and that's when they start to deteriorate and lose all their nutrient quality, I think there's a lot of questions of, can you keep a sourdough starter on the counter made with fresh milled wheat? And yes, you can. The reason for that is because the fermentation process of the sourdough greatly slows down the oxidation process. Keeping a sourdough starter with fresh milled grains is no problem. And again, all the tips that I've talked about before, I like to do with my sourdough starter. So I keep it right there on the counter, right next to where my grain mill is and my wheat berries are. If I'm getting it ready to make like a big loaf, I will measure out the weight of new flour, new water, and the starter that I'm incorporating. I find a 1 to 5 to 5 ratio works really well if you want a good sourdough starter. So 1 part of old starter, 5 parts of wheat berries, and 5 parts of water will get you a really nice starter when you want to bake with it. If I'm not planning to bake, I don't measure it out. I just add, I discard a little bit of my sourdough starter into a container that I keep in the refrigerator to use for discard recipes. And I just put in some wheat berries and some water, enough to keep it fed and happy. And then when I want to bake, that's when I start doing the 1 to 5 to 5. Those are my tips for baking with fresh milled flour. If you want to see how I incorporate baking with fresh milled grains regularly, you can check out this video below. And I hope to see you next time.